Welcome, everyone. Today's episode is going to be a fun one. I think there's a lot of talk in current events about some of the challenges the world has. And to talk about that, I brought two of my really good friends to talk about deep tech, dual use, and defense. And so what you have with us is Nicola Sinclair, partner at Twin Track Ventures, a fund she started, and we'll hear about that more in a moment, and Sam Burrell, partner at Expeditions Fund. And he's also going to share the origin story of his fund. So with that, guys, welcome.
Hi,
Hey,
Simon.
Carlos.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So I think everyone probably wants to know a little bit about Nicola, why you started Twin Track. It's an interesting time we're living in, and the name kind of gives away a little bit about what you're trying to build. So maybe tell us a little bit more about the thesis. What's the story? What you're looking for?
Sure. Yeah, so I see it as the name of the fund, but it's also the approach. The approach is embedded into the fund name. I spent 20 years in defence, and a big part of that was time spent in strategic planning and in capability. And we always had the same problems, and they were never really getting solved. Even when we saw improvements in them, it was like an insatiable appetite for more of the same technologies. And I started to look at what was happening in the startup scene when I was in the Air Force, and it really led me here. And the reason I started Twin Track was that I wasn't seeing the sorts of technologies that as a defense user I wanted to see. I could see like new primes, for example, or people challenging primes, but they weren't necessarily targeting the thing that I, as a defense user, I, as a strategic planner, wanted. But also, in a way, when I was in the Air Force and I was looking at startups, I saw those startups getting some real benefit from working with defense. They were getting amazing reference customer. A lot of these deep tech companies were getting amazing non-dilutive capital without having to go through endless processes and form filling in. And so I really felt there was like a missed approach here on like how the startups work with defense and security and like how that relationship was put together, how they found each other, how they talked to each other, how they pitched, how they explained their problems. And I felt there was role for somebody who could have a foot in both worlds, who'd got experience in both worlds. And that was a long time ago. Obviously, now people are talking a lot about funds in this sector, and there have been a lot of new entrants. So I think for me, as somebody who's always welcoming of new people who want to do interesting things and be a good player, that's great. But sometimes I spend a lot of time working out like, what is your thesis? What are you actually trying to do in the sector that's not already being done? So I think for me, the reason I started it was I felt there was a missing approach, not just like money in the sector, but like a way to link deep tech and defense together in a really interesting way.
So by the time that this episode goes on air, we'll probably have the results of an interesting survey that you're also doing. Do you want to share a little bit more about what
Yeah.
you're trying to find out?
Yeah, so, and Sam, maybe you've experienced this too. Part of being an emerging manager, especially in the sector, is going on panels, talking about your scene, talking about what you're seeing in the sector and in the technology. And you're quite often with people who are maybe coming from a really different place, a really different perspective, or maybe from a different time. I only left the military 4 years ago. So a lot has changed in that 4 years, specifically Ukraine, but it wasn't like 20 years ago. And I was getting a bit frustrated with potentially encountering these ideas that were dated, where people had got stuck in how things were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And so we started the Working with Defence and Security surveys, an annual survey. And it's an opportunity to go out very specifically to technology startups and ask the people building in this space, what are they experiencing? What are they finding? How are things progressing? And really trying to get a feel for not only like what is happening in that sector, but what is the lived experience of those people building in that sector. I think it's really easy to criticize the customer. And believe me, like having been that customer, some of it's super valid. But actually, I think a lot of good happens in those relationships. And so it's not just about like what could we do better. It's also highlighting some of the positive developments that have happened in particularly the last 2 or 3 years as more military people, more military customers, defence and security customers have had more contact with startups, particularly because the map across Europe, the map internationally doesn't look the same, right? Like some countries are doing particularly good jobs of certain things. So that's why we started the survey and do it annually to really get a feel for how things are changing and what do we think is going to happen next in some of these like trend areas.
Yeah, and I want to come back after we get the chance to hear from Sam to the dual use angle, that how you support companies and what chronology of commercial engagement you recommend and prioritize. So just keep that in the back of your mind for a
Yeah.
little later. But Sam, I wanted to switch to you and just to hear your story. You had a very interesting background, similar to Nicola's. You started off in the forces as well, but maybe you can walk us through the chronology of your life and how you ended up where you are.
Thanks, Carlos. I am a partner at Expeditions. There, I specialize in defense and security investments. I think one of the things that I bring to the team is that I have first-hand experience as an end user of defense tech. So, similar to Nicola, I served in the military. I served as a captain in the Royal Marines. And that was a career that included a couple of deployments. So, I deployed to Afghanistan and also to the Indian Ocean. And I use that as a lens through which to view technology that I'm thinking about investing in. I should mention I'm also still a serving reservist. After I left the Marines, I led operations for a rocket internet startup in London. That was a really interesting experience. Learned about profit and loss. These things matter in business. And it was a journey which went from raising money from seed through to Series B. After that, I did an MBA and then I transitioned into venture at Octopus Ventures. Eventually, I went on to join NSIF, which is the National Security Strategic Investment Fund. And from there, I began to specialize in deep tech and actually ended up as the investment lead for quantum at NSIF. And that was a really special privilege during a time when NSIF was doing a lot of quantum investments. Now, obviously, I have joined Expeditions about a year ago, and I'm focused on, as I said, defense and security investments there. I should mention, and I hope you don't mind me saying, Carlos, I publish a weekly newsletter called This Week in Dual Use, which covers the sector, both fundraisers and then some pieces of news on what's going on in defense and security. In terms of Expeditions as the fund, so we actually did an announcement this week on the progress of Fund 2. So we've surpassed 100 million euros in commitments, and we've got line of sight to 150 million at the final close, which will be later this year. That will put us on the map as one of the largest defense and security investors in Europe. And so we're really excited for what the future holds.
Well, it's a
Uh,
great intro from both of you. And thanks, Sam, for mentioning your newsletter. It is one of the very best on the subject on the internet. So if you haven't subscribed, guys, this is your moment. I wanted to jump straight into the theme, right? I started with the word deep tech first rather than defense or dual use, and for a reason, because everyone's definition is a little bit hazy. Some people call it biotech, other people mention quantum. Just walk us through exactly how you define it. What are you excluding? And if you have to explain to a skeptical limited partner why this isn't just another buzzword, what would you say?
You mean specifically on the deep tech side,
Deep
right?
tech,
Like
yes.
why? Yeah, for me, I draw a box around it geographically too, because that really matters, not just in terms of the definition, right? But like where I'm looking, how I'm looking at this. And I think there is an element of geography in like how this unfolds. So because I principally look at Europe, I want startups that are coming with some IP. It doesn't necessarily have to have been through the legal process, but I want them to have something they've already discovered, like whether it's in a lab, whether it's some sort of privileged insight that they've got, which is IPable. There's something in there that inherently gives them a technology moat and a technology flywheel. I don't always see that when I look across at some of the startups that I see coming out of the US. They've maybe got an idea of like where there could be something, but they generally don't have as much in that technical depth at the earliest stages, right? Because I do pre-seed. And for me, what I'm interested in is seeing in there around that moat, around that flywheel, like what is going to make it really super hard for someone else to come along and go, right, they've started, they've got finance, they're onto something interesting. Can we replicate that? I think sometimes in venture, part of this is like, how quickly can you get the money in? How fast can you stay ahead of other people? Some of that exists in deep tech, and we've obviously touched on quantum. But I think that this is in general like a real big distinction between technology and the deep tech side. It's specialist knowledge. It's super hard to get that specialist knowledge. They found something normally because two people from really specialist areas where there are not many people with that specialist skill or specialist training or specialist academic background have come together and found something super insightful, really, really defensible. And that's an exciting place to be as an investor. When you see one of those pitch decks come through, I get this thing that reminds me at 2 o'clock in the morning when I'm looking at a spreadsheet, like, why do I do this? Why do I work in this sector? And it's seeing that like magic coming in that deep tech area.
So for us, Carlos, we have a relatively well-defined definition of deep tech at Expeditions. By deep tech, what we understand are technologies or products that are the result of breakthrough scientific discoveries. So there's really a very scientific element to our definition. What we're looking for in those deep tech founders are usually people coming from research, so often is from universities or they have a background in research, and the technology is backed up typically by a portfolio of patents. So there's some real scientific pedigree to the product and the technology, and that's how we think about it.
So if I just play back a couple of the words you guys used, some level of geofencing, some defensibility elements, specialist knowledge, breakthrough science discoveries, research, and patents. Yeah, I would agree with that. That feels like a fair definition of deep tech. But with that, sadly, comes this issue of deep tech's notorious for running out of money and getting caught in the valley of death between grant funding and commercial traction. And I just want to hear kind of in Europe and with your funds, how do you, as a fund, especially, smaller funds, manage that from a risk profile in light of all the innovation that might sit there?
Yeah, I mean, I really like thinking about this because it matters. Like, I am a smaller fund. For me, part of this is in the founders and how they look as a team. So I think part of what has historically led to that criticism, and it's not unfounded, is you're backing scientists who've got really used to working in a lab, working on a scientific timescale, know there's commercial application, but the team hasn't necessarily always had that like commercial interest in doing things at a startup's pace. So one of the phrases that I often have in mind when I'm talking to somebody is like, let's drag this out of science land. Yes, scientifically it's super interesting, but that's not the purpose of the money, right? The purpose of the money is to get the business going. And when you can see that business going, you can start to see a route then for a large amount of their future revenue to go back into R&D, to keep those discoveries going, to get those new products. That this company isn't a one discovery company. There needs to be some sort of flywheel that keeps that technology, that IP development going. So for me, I want to see founders, like, I actually have not always backed people coming out of a university, and I also don't necessarily like founders who are coming out of an R&D area and a prime. Sometimes I think they're solving for the primed problem, not how the industry will move forward. So it's finding that interesting blends of backgrounds or perspectives in the founders. Sometimes on paper that team doesn't look right, and then you meet the team and you're like, oh, they have this like magic thing, this undefinable quality where they're quite aggressive about commercializing what they're doing. And it doesn't mean they're ignoring the science, but they've just hit that sweet spot between developing science and building a business. They want to see this generating revenue. And I think that's how founders are increasing going in deep tech sector. It's not just about finding a source of funding. It's much more about how do we make this a good business.
Maybe, Sam, as you're about to jump into that, one thing I would like for you to maybe add as well is how your time at NSIF, you thought about government funding in bridging some of that deep tech. If you can just comment on that as well.
And so, yeah, sure. So I'll begin by saying at Expeditions, we take a long-term view of our companies that we're investing in. That's backed up by the fact that we reserve 50% of our fund for follow-on funding. So we're investing not just at the beginning, but also across the journey. The experience from NSIF is that there has to be customer buy-in. So when we were investing at NSIF, typically we would find a customer that had an interest in a technology, then find a company that had a capability matching that interest. And what we would do is invest in the company, but at the same time set up a proof of concept or what we called a work program. So it was really important to match investment with a testing of the capability and the potential for a future contract. Because just investing in a company isn't very good if you're looking to provide capability to the end user. And we take the same approach at Expedition. So when we partner with our companies, we're often looking in for ways that we can help them go to market, to find people in our networks that we can connect them with so that there's actually some kind of revenue potential coming out of the investment, not just money in the bank.
Yeah, and back to your point, Carlos, about like how deep tech is different and also how it's similar. Like, I've been that reference customer, and the way I always think about it is a term that I hear other people using across VC, right? It's customer love. Is that defense and security customer giving you customer love for what that technology company is providing? Are they pulling? I think that's when it gets really exciting, is when you see that coming from the sector.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because we invest in deep tech as well. And I include within that some of the robotics stuff that is currently rolling out with a lot of enhancements from computer vision developments recently. And it is hard. It is a scary thing sometimes, just the cost of some of the hardware required to be able to sell to a customer and front loading that. So it's not one that I think the entire ecosystem has solved yet, but it's sort of a critical thing. And I think that sort of bridge funding for some of these that take a little longer is something that we're going to see develop, I think, in the next few years. But if I think about some of the companies that you guys have backed, especially the ones that sell into some of the bigger or monolithic customers, how do you guys deal with the anxiety, the fear of the incumbents or the primes effectively either cloning, copying, launching, or blocking?
Yeah, I think it's tricky, especially when some of the perceived wisdom in the space is if you're a small startup, you should be working through a prime to get to that customer. It's not something actually the majority of the companies I've personally backed have done. I have a couple where they actually work alongside the prime, and that works really well because the relationship is really reciprocal. So, for example, if you're doing something in the hardware space and defense real estate is important for your connection to that customer, like in the past, I've had a problem where one of the companies I was working with needed to put a device into a plug, and it was going to take 2 years for defense estates to put a plug in the right place, right? That is just an unrealistic timeline for the startup to wait to work with their customer who is in the meantime desperately wanting to engage with their product. Actually, a lot of the primes have real estate on site. That's a really helpful thing for timeline for the startup getting to have that customer contact. And then reciprocally, when the prime does not have that specialist know-how inside their company and is looking to grow into that particular market opportunity that they see, partnering with the startup becomes a really reciprocal process for them. And actually, what I start to see is the prime needs the startup more than the startup needs the prime. Like there are other ways to interact with your customer. You don't always have to go to them in defense and security. So I think that it's case by case, but that it's solvable. And it depends what the company is doing, it depends what stage they're at, and it depends what the prime landscape looks like in that particular technology area. But I think it's one of the things, if you really understand it, gives you an opportunity, right, for picking the portfolio and supporting the portfolio. If you understand how the customer and the prime are interacting on a problem set, you can find these niches where actually the relationships are really balanced and the startup isn't the junior partner getting crushed by that commercial relationship.
Mm.
So to add to that, Carlos, so your question basically is, what are the risks around partnering with primes or selling to primes for startups? It's something that we think about a lot at Expeditions. Primes obviously have the advantage of that they understand the procurement system. And historically, those procurement systems have favored the primes. And so there are situations where startups might partner with primes and even sell to primes in the first instance, because that's a way of understanding the market, of getting your product tested, and of finding the first customer. But typically, what we think about when we're investing in companies is companies that can go beyond that, that can become established medium-sized primes themselves. And so selling to primes might be something that you do at the very beginning of a journey, but it's not something that you want to do for the longevity of a company.
Mm.
What Nicola said around partnering with primes, I think, is really important. We see that's a really useful and strategic route to market. And the reason for that is primes aren't going away. So the defense market, and I know that you want to come onto this a bit later in the conversation, the defense market is this very particular market where there are established numbers of players and they have to exist for a number of reasons. Structurally, they have to exist. And so partnering with them and using that access and the knowledge that they have can be incredibly useful. And the other thing I'd say is we start to see changes in the defense environment. So we're moving, in some cases, from a regular traditional types of contracting to single sourcing, to rapid prototyping. And increasingly, we're seeing individual military units able to contract directly with early stage startups. So startups that have raised less than 10 million are already contracting across different countries with different military units.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's like back into how differentiated what they're doing is how much that customer wants it, right? That's the start of the pull that's helping to really change like some of those commercialization opportunities and giving the younger, earlier stage companies that like direct relationship with the customer.
Yeah. So I want to jump around from deep tech to dual use a little bit before we go into some of the bigger, meatier geopolitical stuff, which I know we're all a bit amused by what's going on and just shocked in some cases, of course. Dual use is a term that, relatively new in terms of every single VC being aware of it in the last year and a half. Nicola, you were very much on the forefront of that early days. And there's a prioritization angle there in terms of commercialization. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how both of you help your founders in getting ready to sell to both sides of that dual use equation.
Yeah, I actually find it has become a tricky phrase. So, like my website, etc., doesn't have the phrase dual use on it because I think it comes now with a little bit of baggage. First of all, discussions around this is just like a get out clause because you have some ESG concerns with like single use, like defense only technologies. Or this criticism that by taking a dual use approach, your company isn't focused, like this, the team are not focusing right on the right things, or they're spreading themselves too thin. I think what that is being a bit binary around is with certain companies, with certain technologies, the company has an opportunity to very coherently on a single roadmap work with defense and commercial customers. So when you have like a near-term opportunity in defense, and I'm thinking about some of these technologies that will end up in robotics, right? But the robotics world is not yet mature enough for them to be getting revenue there. There is a defense use case for them now. There is a defense customer who wants to use that technology now and will use it at a relatively low stage of maturity because they have no solution right now. So they have an urgent need, a difficult problem, and they'll accept a low maturity solution because they have little else to choose from. That's a huge opportunity for a company whose longer term market is in robotics, but that it doesn't really exist yet in the way that it might do in 5 years, 10 years. So to me, that isn't about a lack of focus or some ESG concerns. That is about being really sensible about who is my customer today? How do they advance my roadmap? How do they help me around things like my funding raises, bridges? It may not be genuinely recurrent revenue. With my companies, I tend to look at defense revenue as not recurrent. You never know, even if you're on a multi-year contract, you never really know what it's going to do. But it's revenue that's there, that's from a blue chip customer. But more importantly, they're an amazing reference customer. So what I also often see that comes out of working with both types of customer, defense and security and commercial, is that if you have a commercial customer who's interested, would be a great first commercial customer, the time to convert them from meeting them to them going on contract with you can be dramatically shortened by introducing them to a defense and security reference customer. Because that reference customer is not going to financially gain from your review. Like they're not a partner in a commercial sense, they're not another company, they're a user and they're working on a genuinely difficult problem. And so they can offer a good level of feedback on how this solution is different from other market solutions, like how this has helped them in their difficult problem set. And I think that's like incredible outcome from that early relationship. You may not end up being a defense company, but that early relationship can really support your early stage development if you design it in the right way, right? I think the danger, and we can maybe circle back to this, is those founders who are like, I'm on a defense contract, that's it, I'm made. And if you take that approach, you will die. You need to see this as a reciprocal relationship that is meaningful for you, but that should help you advance your commercialization. That's what I look for. If you do that, you can survive the blocky spending from defense. If you get like one contract from defense and you now think you've done your recurrent revenue, no, it's just not going to work out like that.
What should founders expect from you guys? For example, Sam, maybe you can take this one. From a practical point of view, there are some hygiene criteria simply to sell into one side of that equation. But maybe walk through what is it that you guys do for somebody who's like trying to address both sides of the equation?
Yeah, so your original question, Carlos, how do we help companies be dual used, so to sell into defense and not commercial side of business? The answer to that is usually we help them at the right time. So typically, because we're defense and security investors, we find companies in the defense and security space who are thinking about use cases in national security. And quite often, their first customers will be in national security and defense. But a number of our companies are dual use in nature. So what we find is that their products are applicable outside of defense and security. But the really important part of the venture relationship with the founder is giving the advice of when, not how, but when to do that. And really, it's about the stage of product development. So actually, this ties to what Nicola was saying. Defense or national security can be a great title customer because they're going to help you to develop the product to a point where it's really addressing the use case. And then at that point, you can take it to a commercial environment and make a success of it. The benefit of that is you're diversifying your revenues. So as Nicola said, contract from MOD means that it's a contract from MOD. Even if it's a multi-year contract, you don't know necessarily that they're going to continue after that contract expires. So it can be really helpful. to find customers outside of that. The other thing I would say is we're not scared of single-use companies at Expeditions. So we do have a number of single-use companies in the portfolio. They are selling to defense. They have no plans to sell outside of defense. And that's important too. So we support both of those concepts.
Mm. All right, so let's try to break that down into all the different components of this stuff, because I think similar to deep tech, we covered that it can be quite broad. You look at some of the technologies that dual use and defense have, some of them could be, communications technologies, some of them are encryption technologies, some of them are cloud technologies. And this is where that ambiguity comes from, right? Is that some of them aren't necessarily single use in a very kinetic way. It's literally everything else. And so either one of you, feel free to jump in. Where is the space for venture? What is venture and what is government? Just define that whole spectrum of companies, and then which ones you reckon are really the venture ones and which ones really more of a government investment.
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's something that we think about often, as well as I do, Carlos, that for a venture investment to make sense, you have to have sight of outsized returns. So not every missile needs a cap table, is the title of a famous essay I read recently. That means there are traditional areas of defense that don't need venture investment. But there are areas of defense that are perhaps more software defined that do offer those outsized returns that an investor like you, Carlos, would be used to thinking about. And so those are the things that we like to think about at Expeditions. So software defined hardware that can help you achieve relative advantage compared to legacy systems. The element that we really like to focus on are where we're able to gather data in a way that previously wasn't possible. So if there are some data pools that a company has access to that previously wasn't possible, that's really interesting. You can feed them into the software, and that becomes a really valuable technology to provide to national security.
I mean, like the way I think about this, and it's sort of taking a couple of steps back, is sort of add to what Sam said. Somebody said that everything is dual use, and to a degree, I can understand where their thinking is coming from. But what they're missing, and I think where specialist investors in this sector really bring something, is that you need a lens, right? Because if everything is dual use, like nothing is dual use, how does the customer pick from that? They've only got a limited amount of money. They've only got a limited amount of time and energy, and they need to pick the things following the Pareto principle that really move the needle for them. And their business is effectively in like lethality. So taking a trip backwards in time, maybe 7 years ago, when I was looking at this from the military perspective, I was in uniform, engaging with startups very early on in that journey. The number of pitch decks we got sent for vertical farms, and they were like, you could grow food in deployment bases and you could really help your soldiers get loads of fresh food and great nutrition. I spent like almost a year living in a quarter mile by quarter mile military camp, eating like the world's worst food. And I knew the nutrition was terrible, but the big MOD did not really care about my nutrition for a year, right? So trying to sell them a Palo Alto backed vertical farm was not really going to happen. In theory, that could be dual use, but in reality, it's just not a priority. Like you're not going to get the engagement from defense and security customer on that. If you do, it's going to be somebody around welfare, and it's going to be like a very small thing. It's going to be like a one and done trial. But if you look at something that's really solving a pain problem, like we talked about quantum, for example, and its role in a number of different ways in defense and security, that's a completely different conversation with defense and security user, because they're absolutely terrified about the threat, the core threat from something like quantum that's both an advantage but also a concern. So having the background, having a lens by which you can pass these technology areas and say, this is a priority, this is really going to meaningfully change. So I think what we see in this sector around dual use is not just what technologies are happening that we can apply in defense and security, but like what evolutionary steps forwards are happening technologically that unlock amazing opportunities for defense forces, right? Because ultimately we want to be defense forces. Like just the fact that we exist and act as a deterrent would be a great place to be. Like most people in the military, especially as they get more senior and more experienced, don't really want to go to war again because it's absolutely horrible. So trying to move beyond this idea of can we apply hydroponics and fresh fruit and vegetables in a military base towards what could we work with, what technology can we bring inside defense and security that makes us like a really seriously threatening and credible opponent so that we don't have to enter into a hot conflict. That sort of thinking, I think, is really key here. And it's that lens of like, how does this technology actually move the needle forward for the buyer? I think that's sometimes what's really missed in people who want to start pitching to defense and security customer. Yes, it can be applied, but does it move the needle forward? And do you have the understanding on how to articulate that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you bring up is this idea. I'm just going to put a label on it. I'm going to call it speculative problem set, right? This vertical farm is a speculative problem set. Oh,
Right.
I think you probably have this idea. People aren't eating it. So it's companies that are selling dual use or single use stuff, but it's a speculative idea. Oh, you could really use this. If you did this and you did that, it could do this and it would solve this major problem. And one of the things that I think may not be obvious to the listeners is the distinction that a founder needs to make between approaching things from a speculative problem set point of view. I'm going to build this and hope they buy it
Right.
versus an urgent need problem set. Now, Sam, how does a founder discover this? Because in a software as a service world or in a commercial business world, you have like API integrations that are available to you. Everyone's on Twilio or Stripe payments or something. And you can kind of guess like, oh, if you use Shopify, you have this and I'm going to sell into you. This is the API integrations for which things you use, and Zapier this. How does that work when all this stuff is generally behind the scenes, closed doors, completely locked down? How is it that you can either invest in a company where you're not aware of the problem set in its urgency, or even help them integrate?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'll break it down into two parts. The first part is occasionally we do invest in products that don't yet have a problem set, and one of those examples is quantum computing.
Mhm.
So we don't know what the problem set is, but we're still trying to figure out what problems quantum computers will solve, right? Will that be in national security? Probably. But will it also be in finance and trading? Yes, most likely. And perhaps they'll be the first use cases for quantum computing. So, in that area in particular, what we do is we invest in the best people and we trust that they're going to build a product that will be useful. And so we do take an approach that is more product led than problem led in some specific areas. But to get to the nub of the question, Carlos, how do you build against a problem set that is behind a barbed wire fence? It's hard. So I was at the European Defence Tech Hackathon last weekend, in fact, and there were a bunch of young, intelligent computer scientists holed up in a what I can only describe as a common room in the HAC barracks, hacking. They spent a weekend developing prototypes for defense. And I went in and gave them 5 minutes on this is how venture thinks about investing in early stage founders in the space. And one of the questions to my pitch was, well, Sam, that's great, but how do we know what the customer wants? We're sitting here, we don't have any access to these people, and how do we get out there and find it? And the honest answer is it's really tough. You've got to really, so two things. You've got to really want to understand the problem well and to work to make those connections. And secondly, it really helps to have a background in the space. So a heuristic that we use quite often at expeditions is, are these people founding who are coming from the intelligence community or perhaps from the special forces, and they have a really deep understanding of a problem set, and they're combining that with perhaps some outside technical expertise, and they're creating something really innovative to go after that problem. And those are the types of founders that we find that can break through the tricky walls that are erected.
Right, because it's a bit like saying like I want to be a like fintech founder and I haven't done a job in finance, right? You can't necessarily hand over the problems to people and say, please try and work on these. Like for example, they're classified, they keep changing. I think there's also a role for specialist investors. We've used the lens a few times, like in finding people who don't realize they're building a solution. That's where I really feel like I earn my money effectively, is in spotting that actually there is something here that's been designed for one purpose that has another role that is super valuable. And it may not be the reason the company does brilliantly, but it could be a great early customer. Like it can really give their target customer, whatever sector that's in, some additional confidence. So it's not taking the company on a weird journey. It's giving the company a here and now market that will still support their plan, but they didn't know existed. Like a beachhead market they just didn't know existed and was relevant for what they're doing.
Yeah.
Carlos, sometimes we go as far as finding people coming from that environment national security or defense, and they're coming out and they have an understanding of a problem, haven't necessarily built a product to address it. And we're teaming them up with people who might be able to help them with that.
Right.
So we're actually starting to put people together and do a tiny bit of incubation because we're finding that there's guys and girls coming out, they maybe in years gone by would have joined a consulting firm or one of the big banks. And actually, what we want to do is turn them into founders. And we say to them, come meet these people who are building in AI, bring those skill sets together and create a product that addresses that problem set.
Yeah, fair enough. And look, that is the value you guys bring with your backgrounds, right? You also understand that and have your own connections. Moving on to what's going on in the world today. Sam, you write, as we mentioned earlier, one of the best newsletters, and hopefully, Nicola, your survey will also generate some really great traction on this. But Sam, over the years that you've been writing it now, what would you say are the stories that you've been most shocked about, not necessarily from a negative point of view, but from like a commercial point of view or from a investment point of view or from the integrations point of view? What has stood out that you're like, man, I can't believe I'm writing this?
I tend to write about defense and national security technology and the intersection of that and geopolitics and some elements of investment. One thing that has stood out recently is first thing would be China is way ahead in defense tech. I found that every week I was writing some piece about a new bit of Chinese defense tech. And I went away and did my own research and because no one is really talking, not in Europe, I did my own research into what they've developed, how they do it, and what the plan is for the next few years. And it blew me away. The way that they see the creation of technology and the motivation of society is completely different. We in the West, we carve out defense from everything else that happens. In China, they have something called civil military fusion. So if you're developing an autonomous vehicle, right, you might also be developing some elements of computer vision in the same factory that go into a drone targeting system. So that's the first thing. Second thing that really stood out to me was a recent piece of news that the UK, during Donald Trump's visit to the UK, announced the awarding of a 750 million software contract to Palantir. So what does that tell you? It tells you that we might talk about homegrown defense and national security startups in UK and in Europe. But when it comes down to the brass tacks of politics, actually, and growth that the Labour Party is looking to achieve, that doesn't matter. We'll hand those, the biggest software contract that has ever been awarded, we'll hand that to a Palantir, which, it also tells you that maybe that's the company and the technology that's able to provide what we have asked for in the contract. It's a tricky situation.
I mean, I think you bring up some really good points there, Sam. And Nicola, maybe you can share your views. When you look at export controls, you look at tariffs, you look at some of the things that are geofenced, is Europe building an independent capability, or is it simply just betting on a subsidiary ecosystem of the US market?
I am going to be really annoying and say I think it's too early to tell. I think that we have the potential to build that, but I think we're getting really tangled up in this word sovereignty. So I feel like we're taking sovereignty to be super literal. And what I mean by that is it's a sovereign capability if the CEO has a passport from that country and the headquarters is in that country. I don't think we're thinking about it in a really helpful way. I think I'd equate the word sovereignty with the word control. And if you can bring together a multinational system, whether the system is European or it has US elements or whatever elements in it, but your degree of control is super, super high, I don't think we should care about that so much. Don't think this passport thing, this national flag thing is particularly helpful. In the time I spent in capability development, I actually saw it cause like some really bad decisions because we were trying to overbalance for flags, right? Rather than taking the sensible, pragmatic solution that created like the best technology and the best technological outcome and capability. But I think we need to get really real about vulnerabilities. And this is somewhere government's really bad. About 20 years ago in the UK, we cut all of our spending on vulnerability assessment. we now effectively have to reverse engineer a lot of the understanding of our vulnerabilities in infrastructure and critical national infrastructure. And that could be everything from power through to communications, through to some of our relationships with other countries. And I think that that is causing us to have a real lack of clarity over the level of control that we have in something that we're buying or that we're putting on contract. And as a result, we are being really literal about this word sovereignty. And I think that that is really difficult because you might think that you're working with a sovereign entity and they then may decide to IPO somewhere else or, move their headquarters somewhere else. So I think that this literal interpretation is actually causing a lot of problems and we should get rid of it and use the word control. How high a degree of control do we have as a customer? Or are we effectively buying the defense equivalent of the iPhone where we're just using it and we don't really understand what's happening below the surface?
I
I
think
want to
it's
jump.
something that is we're going to see play out actually over the next sort of years,
Yes.
which is what capabilities European nations think are sovereign. Is it a quantum computer? Is it a drone? And then what degree of sovereignty do they want across those capabilities? And it's unclear at the moment what that looks like. Nicola, I like the idea of control. I don't think governments are ready to adopt that yet.
No, but we talked about quantum compute, right? You can have
Yeah.
this amazing sovereign capability that's in your country. Somebody turns the power off for that thing, and you don't have it anymore. So my point really here, I think, is around actually better understanding of where we need to have it. I think what we're reaching for in Europe at the moment is reactionary, where we can say this consortium, whatever, is 100% British. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's 100% invulnerable to threat.
Yeah, I want to jump on that in a second because I want to talk about supply chains in a bit. We'll come back to that. But first, I want to touch on the word vulnerability and vulnerability studies that you mentioned, Nicola, because one of the things that is interesting about any kind of vulnerability study is that it assumes things that have happened in the past. This is a classical issue, right? You kind of prep for what you know and rather than what's going to
Right.
happen and that somebody else comes up with. In recent news in Munich and in Denmark, the headlines show some unexpected use of drones in airspace and some stuff that vulnerability studies may have not caught on to and are not equipped to deal with. So how do you guys as investors stay on balance between what you're reading in the current events and thinking, this hasn't been assessed as part of a purchase plan, but it is something that maybe you, as somebody who is like just reading the news and maybe going on Reddit and seeing what's going on, or you like devise something or you preview a sort of vulnerability that the country doesn't yet see and then retroactively act to it.
Right. I mean, first of all, as you say, the enemy has a vote and they can get really creative. So I think it's an impossible challenge, but there is a way of being logical and coherent in what you do and what you invest your time and resources into. So one of the roles I had when I was in the military was a strategic planner, like really, really large scale strategic planning. And so back to that lens around picking technologies, like does this technology make sense longer term for somebody like me as a strategic planner, either planning a proactive operational planning, a defense, right? Or actually, is it cumbersome? Is it clunky? Is this just going to be a here and now solution? So we're talking about drones, drone incursions. I would point to the evolution we've seen in the counter drone space over the last 5 years or so. When was it? About 2012, I think, maybe around then, that we had the drone incursion in Heathrow and it closed Heathrow airspace. And a lot of the counter drone companies we see are still dealing with that kind of threat. Like, where is the operator? How do the police find them, detain them, and do forensics on the drone? Well, we saw a drone incursion yesterday in Munich. That is still a threat. But do we think that's going to be the major issue? Or do we need to see counter drone technologies emphasizing, like, how do you deal with a million drones? How do you deal with overwhelm? How do you automate it? And we lack some of the foundational technologies in that sector. Like, we are really obsessed with automating autonomous agents in the physical world, so drones. No one is automating air traffic. In fact, there's like one company where I am an investor, I should say, but they are trying to automate air traffic. And it's so difficult to get defense and security interest in that. But yet it's foundational. You cannot have one person with a telephone and a radio controlling airspace with thousands of autonomous agents. And you can't build some of the counter drone at scale that you need without some of these foundational technologies or approaches in place, like digital approaches in place. So that's how I start to try and think about it as a planner. How easy is it to start to pull things together in that sector? Or are we missing some of those building blocks? Like, is that technology going to sit on its own, or is it going to nest into other supportive things that it needs in order to function properly and scale? Ultimately, that's always the question. Can this scale without a dependency on something else? And does that other thing exist?
So I think it's a great question, Carlos. And I think, as you will know, as a venture investor, one of the things that you're trying to do, and if you're good at your job, you do better than others, is to look into the future and to see a world that exists in a few years' time. And Carlos, you're perhaps better than many others. And when you talk about vulnerabilities, that's what we try to do on a daily basis, is try to understand what a geopolitical environment is going to look like in 2 to 5 to 8 years' time, and then be investing against that future environment. We've been doing that already. So at Expeditions, we've been investing in counter UAS systems. We made our first investment in that space over a year ago. And then last month, Poland starts to have Russian drone incursions into its airspace. Recently, Denmark has closed a number of airports because of a drone incursion. So we're seeing those predictions that we made start to come true. If you ask me for another example, where it would be Atlantic, Baltic Sea, we're seeing similar Russian activity, these kind of grey zone operations. That might be an interesting place to be investing, even though there's relatively little funding for it at the moment from European ministries of defence. That could be a future area of increased funding. And so these are the things that we think about on a daily and weekly basis.
So with that, I think the word that the media have been using, which I mean, it's been around for a while, but it's a recent use in the mainstream, is the hybrid warfare discussion. And Sam, as you're talking about the future of any kind of warfare and for the 5, 10 years in the future, there's other elements to it on top of that, which includes disinformation, misinformation, cyber, psyops. And maybe you can both comment on how you guys think about that part of deep tech, which does tend to sometimes have much more dual use capability than the more sort of UAS type stuff.
Yes, so disinformation is a problem. We, as a country and as Europeans, haven't really figured out how to deal with it. The Russians have been very good at propagating it and using it to affect outcomes, although not always successfully, I should say. So, in Romania, they weren't eventually able to affect the outcome of the election, but they did give it a good go. I think that there will be a European disinformation champion. It's a capability that must exist. I think that it's a capability that needs to have some kind of action behind it, where technology is able to take down a piece of disinformation as soon as it's spotted. It's something that we're actively thinking about and we would love to invest against.
Yes, same. I mean, I think I probably in the last 6 months, I've seen at least 5 or 6 pitch decks for companies building in the space. I think what's difficult, and I haven't made a deal, I haven't done an investment in that yet, but I probably will from this fund. I think what's difficult is working out of their approaches, which is the right one. For me, I think I'm still watching some of this unfold. And it's not clear actually to me how it will unfold. A lot of them are very, very focused on social media. I think that has a place. I think what I'm trying to understand in there is how much of this is truly deep, like how much of this has really got an opportunity to grow and scale as we see this kind of technology evolve. How much of it at the heart of this company is about machine learning and something really interesting, like how are they uncovering, how are they surfacing some small signal in that volume, not just dealing with volume and summarization. Like that is an issue, but I think there is a bigger issue here about understanding small things that have a big impact very early on and helping defense and security and governments do their resource allocation.
Talking about resource allocation, government budgets, defense budgets, and just budgets in general are cyclical. Now, if you, as investors, remind the audience a little bit of the bubbles that have come and gone in the past, we can pinpoint the crypto bubble that has gone up and down. We can look at clean energy bubbles from 2008 and 10, and they go through cycles. And one of the things that it's not obvious, if you look at the current wave of interest in the space, a lot of investors that are coming into the space publicly and privately, the M&A market for the space hasn't really grown in equal proportion. Most exits are sub 500 million. And you're looking at a potential mismatch between the capital that's coming into companies, what's coming out from an IPO point of view or from an M&A point of view, the customer potentially being caught in a cyclicality depending on elections and any kind of political swings. Walk me through how you justify that as a solitary thesis in spite of all these things affecting the predominant volume of investments you guys make.
Yeah, it's something that keeps me as a dual use investor. So defense and security, I come from it. I've wore the uniform for 20 years and then I meet a new LP and they're like, wait, you actually are from the defense community, but it's not a defense first fund. And they find that initially like really surprising. And then I walk them through like my previous investment track record and I explain where some of the companies that have not endured, what happened. And a lot of the time it's with the customer, right? Like the big MOD customer and that blocky cyclical spending issue. There is an issue that sits behind that, and it's the decision maker. The customer is a human. It's not a like multi-thousand person entity. Sometimes that human changes over in their job and a project has been going really well, a contract has been going really well. The human changes over and they 180 the prioritization inside that piece of work. And overnight, the company dies because they do not have any other customer. They've built this technology exclusively for this customer. Another customer doesn't want it anymore. So the way I think about it is that the technology needs to be not solving one thing. It needs to be progressing forward in a really high optionality way. If it doesn't work just in defense and security, for me as an investor, that's okay because the companies I back have the opportunity to grow and scale to VC scale in at least one other market, ideally more than one other market, right? That's how I think about it. And that's why, for me, the majority of single use stuff just doesn't work. I can't understand how to package it into a portfolio. But that's my lived experience with the companies that I work with in my personal track record. There will be some that are single use that do scale in that way. I think what's muddying the water at the moment is the over indexing on drone hardware, which is maybe like a whole nother podcast in itself. But that money is not evenly spread. So some of it I think is going to make an excellent return. It's signal and noise issue again.
Carlos, to pick up on your point about the exit market, it's a really good one. Primes are valued typically at 1.5 to 2 times their revenues. And that is not how we value startups and the companies that we're investing in. And so if, as a venture investor, you sell one of your businesses to a prime and you value it at 10 times revenue, and the prime would have to immediately destroy 80% of the value of that company in order to subsume it into their business. And so typically and historically, primes have been very bad acquirers of early stage and even later stage startups in the space for exactly that reason. I see that changing over the next few years for two reasons. Firstly, we see the emergence of neoprimes, so the likes of Anduril, of Helsing. We can also bucket Tech Ever and Quantum Systems into those. And they're going to start to become, and in Anduril's case already has become, highly acquisitive. And because they're valued at higher multiples than traditional primes, they can actually acquire those companies from venture portfolios. So that's one thing. And then secondly, the secondaries market is actually really developing in a way that it probably wasn't sort of 5 years ago. We're seeing companies stay private for longer, the growth of both early stage but later stage capital and secondary funds being formed and coming to market. And so for venture investors, exits can take the form of secondaries in the later stages of a company. I can tell you now the secondaries market for Anduril is incredibly liquid. If you wanted to get some Anduril shares or some SpaceX shares, Carlos, I'm sure you have the right people in your Rolodex to speak to about that. So it's not something that worries me or keeps me up at night. It's just that the environment is changing at the moment.
So you brought up one of the topics that I wanted to bring up, maybe my next to last question for you guys, SpaceX, and just generally the area of outside of the Earth's atmosphere. Prior to what was happening in the conflicts that are going globally, there was a explosion of investing in space tech, and it sort of died down a little bit. It's not as popular as it once was, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm just wondering, where does that sit in your thesis? Because to some extent, it is its own unique thing, its own unique sort of suppliers, all that. And then another one is the sort of market sizing. It might only have one or two customers. Maybe it's the same customer. Where does space fit into your thesis? And to go back to that question is, in light of the technologies that are used for space, including compute and everything, how do you deal with secure supply chains?
Right. I actually think there's a lot of read across between what we see in cyber and what we see in space, and that they are dual use technologies, like truly dual use technologies, and recognized as so for a really long time. I think the thing is the way the early stage market is and how international it is, but also how many startups have ideas that dramatically overlap. And my thinking around cyber is that you could very easily run a fund exclusively focused on cyber and still have a real job trying to clean out your pipeline and make sure you're looking at the right companies in that pipeline internationally. I think the same thing about space. I see it as like a specialism within dual use. And one thing I really see with the angels that I talk to and co-invest with, a lot of them are generalist in this sector, but several of them have then become LPs in either cyber funds or in space funds because it's a volume issue. Separating out that volume is really, really difficult in those sectors. And I think it makes them almost like a subset practically for investors in there. You need to just do that subject to really get across all of it and be able to map the competitors and work out which one is the one that you believe in.
Yeah, so it forms an important part of our investment thesis at Expeditions. Look, it's a sector that is foundational. I'm using space technology on a day-to-day basis, as I'm sure most people are. And it's geopolitical in a way that we often don't realize, but there are kind of battles playing out at the moment in space. There was a report in the news this morning about Russian interference with British military satellites. They've been using this ground-based laser, which is quite interesting. And then they've also deployed some of their Cosmos anti-satellite satellites, which have been running quite close to some British military satellites. So the Russians are using it as an area of, again, like the Baltic Sea and drone incursions over Polish airspace. It's an area where they're testing NATO, and it's really interesting to see how that is playing out at the moment. For Expeditions, we think that there are some really unique opportunities in space technology that will be coming up, and that's due to technology development. So, in particular, the explosion of Earth observation data, we think, is creating an opportunity around, how do you visualize that data in a way that previously you didn't? So there are some companies that we think are really interesting in the data orchestration space. And then secondly, something like synthetic aperture radar is a technology that's existed since the Cold War, but it's technology that is continually being updated. And so it gets better and better as people are putting more time and effort into improving the different bandwidths that are being used. And it's more and more important for those national security and military operations across the continent. And so we see some companies coming through in Europe that are doing novel types of modular synthetic aperture radar that we think are going to be really successful.
Yeah, it's interesting. And we've tried looking at just space, not with a specific angle other than just the sector, everything from satellites. It's very hard to crack. But it's exciting too. We're gonna have to make first contact at some point. We're gonna have to have spaceships. I'm a big sci-fi fan. So at some point, we're gonna have to leave the planet. So to wrap up, I just wanted to make sure that we had a chance also to talk again a little bit about yourselves. And this is a question that obviously puts you on the spot, but if I were a skeptical LP and I asked you guys, why are you the right steward of capital in the most geopolitically sensitive area of venture? And why will you be the one that returns within 10 years the funds that I've given you? What is your answer in one breath?
Shall I go first, Sam?
Go for it.
Yeah, okay. So I would say to you that it's because I'm in the 0.05% of Europeans with relevant defence experience. So if I could take another breath and like justify why I've put myself in such a tiny percentage, it's that like there's 750 million people in Europe, but very few of them have been on active duty service. So only 0.2% of Europeans have ever been on active duty, and the majority of people don't stay in defence and security that long. Most people do sub 10 years. So to graduate into those capability jobs where you start to look at not only like what does a defence user need, but how is it bought, how is it built, how does it like deploy and be used, you need to really be in the military more than 10 years, ideally like 20. So to have stayed in the military for 20 years and then you mix that in with and then worked in venture for a period of time where I've used and learned with somebody else's funding, not the funds that you, the LP we're talking about now, are going to give me, it ends up being this like vanishingly small percentage. And there's my answer for you. We often like look at startup founders by like, do we think this person's top 1%? Well, by experience level in defense and by some venture background, that becomes this tiny, tiny sub 1% number.
Okay, so my answer is look, because it's where I've built my career at the intersection of national security and defense. I've been investing in defense and dual use for years. I know the founders and the customers who shape the sector. And frankly, that matters in a market where timelines are long and credibility is everything.
Yeah. Well, guys, it's been a pleasure. This is such a complicated and difficult topic because it's changing all the time. There's a lot of pressure, budgets are changing, and we could have kept on going for hours. But just want to thank you both for your time and for your insights, and it's been great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks, Carlos.
Thanks, Carlos. It's a pleasure as always.
Bye, guys.
Bye.